Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lauren Cornegay-Dollar and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. We're very excited to have all of you streaming in from all over the place. Today's webinar is entitled Blackboards and Bomb Shelters, Insights from the Authors. I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. His name is James P. Bevill and he is the author of Blackboards and Bomb Shelters.
Well, thank you, Lauren. It's glad to be here. Thanks everybody for tuning in for part of your day. And I'm really happy to be associated with this in the National Museum of the Pacific War. A part of the war that a lot of people forget about or never knew about was the China, Burma, India theater. And my previous work was as a Texas history author, but I came across a family archive. My wife's father, Paul Springer, who, as you can see on your screen, this is a picture of him, and he was about 24 years old on his Chinese driver's license. They left behind, and it was only until he was well into his 90s when we found these hundreds and hundreds of letters from China, Vietnam, and so forth. And so, as the only semi-academic in the family, I sat down and read through these for several months. And then I got the papers from his colleagues, Jim Elliott, Wynn Pettis, and Art Hopkins from Yale University. And I put together the story. It's a true story. It's all primary sources, but let me just give you a little bit from the beginning. Paul Springer was born August 25th of 1917 in Merchantville, New Jersey. He attended public schools in nearby Camden, and he learned a competitive exam in April of 1937 for a school full scholarship to Yale University. He was one of several successful candidates for scholarship that year that Yale had offered. He was accepted. He began taking classes in the fall of 1837. Now, admission to Yale was a life-changing event for him. His lack of funds put pressure on him to work to meet expenses while away from home. Like many students, he waited on tables for extra money, but he quickly got tired of it. He volunteered to usher at Yale football games, which gave him free admission, sang in the Yale Glee Club, and he majored in English literature. In the spring semester of 1938, Springer was required to choose a sport. He decided to take up boxing, even though he only weighed in at 152 pounds. He was able to secure a spot on the Yale boxing team, and he was coached by a recent University of Michigan graduate and a football star named Gerald Ford. He went by Coach Jerry Ford. Ford received offers from two pro football teams, the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers, but chose a position as an assistant boxing and football coach at Yale while he pursued a law degree. Even though Springer was new to the sport, he held his own in his weight class against others, and he contended for the varsity. And Ford now is best known as the 38th President of the United States. The students were keenly aware of the war in Europe and that the conflict might spread. Several speakers came to speak on the war at Yale that year. Charles Lindbergh visited the Yale campus in 1940, and Springer heard him firsthand promote his isolationist America First agenda. And he was a noted speaker, had done quite the tour, but the French secretary had come to Yale to give a talk on the war in Europe earlier that year and the aims of the French. In the next week, the German ambassador gave a talk at Yale to tell their side of the story. All the students were required to register for draft. They registered right on campus. They came right up to the dorms and signed them up for the draft. Now, in March of 1931, Springer was encouraged by one of his Yale professors to apply for a teaching position at the Yali Middle School in Yunlin. This was in the Hunan province of China. It was a prestigious appointment to an important Yale institution. Only 3 candidates every other year were accepted, and Yale-in-China offered him the opportunity to partake in an important educational and humanitarian mission, and he could see a part of the world that few Americans had seen or given much thought to. It was not going to be a vacation. because at the time, Japan was currently at war with China during the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945. Here is a map of Yale-in-China. You see this map highlighting Changsha in the epicenter of Yale-in-China. It was a key stop on the railroad that ran from Canton in the south to Peking in the north. Today, those cities are known as Guangzhou and Beijing. Now, Yale-in-China sponsored this cluster of educational and medical institutions, of which the middle school was one. These were established in the capital of Hunan by a group of Yale graduates early in the 20th century. The founders demonstrated Christian fellowship, they served as educators, they served as doctors, and they set examples for hard work and the betterment of their communities. This was public service at its best. This endeavor, the Yale endeavor, took place when China proposed sweeping educational reforms, emphasizing science, medicine, and engineering by the late 1930s. Now, the institutions, these universities, had developed faster than the scholars had been able to produce textbook in Chinese, resulting in the use of any available text on the subject matter, most of which happened to be in English. This prompted a national movement to teach English to Chinese students beginning in middle school and on into high school. For these reasons, the English classes at Yale were at the forefront of the educational shift in China. Now, these came from a quote from Confucius. Ya stands for excellence of expression and civility. The Chinese character Li means propriety and right conduct. And so this is where the name the Yale Middle School, and it rang synonymously with Yale. The 2-year teaching stint in China was referred to as the bachelor program. The term bachelor was used to indicate that each of the teachers had a bachelor's degree versus a master's or a postgraduate degree. Now, the bachelors, and Springer was a bachelor, he was paid a modest teaching stipend along with the travel expenses to and from China. It was thought that the young male teachers would inspire and energize their Chinese students, although in the 1930s, the program was viewed by some as a way for the bachelors to escape prohibition and get a free trip around the world. At first, he had to get there. Once Springer was appointed, he traveled by train from New Jersey to Seattle, then from Seattle to San Francisco, where he would meet the other bachelors and take a ship across the ocean. Now, here they are on your left. You'll see Paul Springer, Art Hopkins, and Jim Elliott. Their executive director, Robert Ashton Smith, is on the right. They're going to take the SS President Harrison from San Francisco to Honolulu to Shanghai and then Hong Kong. So they disembark on July 23rd in 1941. Now, Paul, Art, and Jim, or Springer, Hopkins, and Elliott, they didn't really know each other. They had met each other. They had talked before, but they didn't really know each other until they boarded this ship. But because they had 3 weeks before they were gonna get to China. The ship had a number of U.S. Navy men on board that were bound for Manila. The final destination of the ship was in Singapore. They would get off in Hong Kong. The Navy guys would get off in Manila. But on board for 3 weeks, they really got to know each other. So this is really literally a slow boat to China. Jim Elliott and Paul Springer participated in a tennis tournament on board, but Jim earned the scowls of his fellow teachers for refusing to play with a woman partner. He was really looked down upon by the others at first. Although Paul didn't price in the tennis, he made some good friends on board, notably Captain Albert H. Rooks of the U.S. Navy, who was bound for Manila, who he first met on the train from Seattle. Now, I mentioned these were family archives. My wife's grandmother saved every letter she ever received from Paul while he was overseas. But I saw the name in the letter, Captain Albert H. Rooks, and sure enough, there he is on the right-hand side, Captain Albert H. Rooks, U.S. Navy. Captain Rooks and his wife rode down together from Seattle. Springer rode with them, and she accompanied him as far as Honolulu, where she was to get off and wait out his assignment as he took command of the heavy cruiser USS Houston in Manila, the flagship of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet. It was Rooks that Springer went head-to-head with in the chess tournament, with Springer defeating him in the single finals before losing to another man in what he called a careless mood. So their ship docked in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in the summer of 1941. The men dropped their mail at a local post office. They took a try at surfing. They donned Hawaiian leis and Hawaiian shirts. They recalled the day on shore with fond memories. But from Hawaii to Japan, they went almost 2 weeks without seeing land of any kind. And the vastness of the ocean and the travel of those days was difficult for them to comprehend. By August the 12th, they passed several islands in the Japanese group, and they saw one of their volcanoes. The ship had a port of call in Shanghai. They had 2 days on shore, most of which was under Japanese occupation. It was a great, swarming, cosmopolitan city of 3,500,000 people, although parts of it had been devastated during the war. By the summer of 1941, the eastern part of China, with its port cities and industrial areas, were already lost to the Japanese. They also lost the customs revenue, the best farmlands, the advanced infrastructure of the modern cities. These are sections that were referred to as occupied China. They had fun there. They went to dance halls. They went to nightclubs. They wrote about the taxi dance girls that you could rent them for dances. And the boys were thrilled with that. Springer never wrote home to his mother about that, but Jim Elliot wrote letters to Yale. So it's nice when you see the bigger picture when you put them all together. The men went to Hong Kong. They were treated like royalty during their 12 days in Hong Kong, where their Yale calling cards opened a lot of social doors for them. This is their last stop on the ship, where they disembarked in Kowloon, the peninsula at Hong Kong. They looked for flights that would take them to the interior, but there were no commercial flights. So they're trying to get from down here on the right, Hong Kong, below Canton, to Yale-in-China. And this is where they were introduced to Brank Fulton. Brank Fulton was a former bachelor, a former Yale bachelor, and now a Yale tried administrator. He secured the flights. He secured the flights on 2 Condor freight planes, each of which had 2 jump seats, 2 in one and 2 in the other. And if you look on this map in the middle from the left to the upper right, you see the Hua Chung College was in Huishao. The Guiyang College was the medical college. The middle school and the branch hospital was in Yunling, and the main hospital and the main campus was in Changsha. These are all Yale-in-China institutions, except the epicenter was Changsha. So they're going to fly these Condor planes. They took off right at dusk, and they're going to get into nationalist China, which is the part that is not under Japanese control. So they fly at dusk by Condor plane to Yamyang. It's about 200 miles inland. Once they arrived at Yamyang, they were acutely aware of the war. Paul described the next leg of their trip. He said, quote, "We landed in a drizzle and we walked to a thatch hut where our passports and calling cards were examined by youthful groups of soldiers, several of whom I'm certain are not over 16. Then we had coolies take our luggage to town, a distance of about 2 miles, and we followed in a crew burning truck." It was a rough ride, bad roads, bad driver. It all gets there. Then everything gets unloaded and it goes on another truck because they've got to have another 5-hour ride to Shikowan to stay at a YMCA, which is arranged by a Methodist minister. However, once they get to Shikowan, the missionary was not in town, so their rooms had been released. But then they found an English-speaking attendant at the front desk who put them in the storage room because it was raining outside. So they slept with their luggage on the floor of a damp room with mosquito netting over them. They burned incense all night to drown out the smell of excrement from the latrine next door. Springer saying, quote, "It would have made a pigsty look sumptuous and immaculate." So they had lunch with another missionary on the following day, and they took an evening train from Shikowan north to Hyenyang, reaching the end of the line in Xiangtan at 8:15 the next morning. That brings them about 460 miles inland between the plane and the train. That's not that far from Changsha. When they arrived in the train station at 8:15 in the morning, it was empty, except for a few railroad employees. The city was empty. The difference in the city's scenery was in stark contrast to the lovely rolling hills and green trees and everything else they saw outside the windows of the trains. Soon as they got to an urban area, the destruction really hit them. It surrounded them all sides. Xiangtan had suffered from heavy bombings from the Japanese all summer. Looked like a ghost town, empty streets, buildings in shambles, gaunt, mangy dogs lurking about. They managed to secure a couple of rickshaws. They handed the rickshaw driver the directions to the mission hospital in Chinese, and then they arrived at the Presbyterian mission residences in Xiangtan. Now there, they were welcomed by Miss Woods. She offered them coffee and some lunch. She had been expecting them. She had arranged a boat that was going to take them up the river to Changsha to the Yale headquarters. And they asked her, "Where is everybody? There's nobody around. This is China. There's supposed to be 1 billion people there." She explained that a Chenpao had gone off that morning, and that's an air raid siren. And everyone, including all the doctors and all the nurses, had fled to the fields in terror. But the second alarm never went off, so she mused that it must have been a scouting plane. This was followed by a 3-hour boat trip from Xiangtan to Changsha. It was a relatively quiet trip. It was just the 3 bachelors, the crew, and their luggage. So when they get to Changsha, this is a view of the Yale Changsha campus. At the far right, you'll see a small notation above the pictures. This is the hospital building. Right below that is a recreation center. Next to that is a medical college. You see the science building. The fourth from the right and at the left is a chapel. What you don't see in the picture, you don't see the housing. You don't see guest quarters on the left. And the part on this side of the fence would be the Yale middle school and the senior school and the dormitories, all of which are vacated because the school had to move in 1938. The reason that it moved is that the eastern city of Nanking was overcome by panic and horror from the invasion of the Japanese in 1937. And the Jap soldiers had bullied, raped, killed, burned, and looted the city in one of the most horrific war crimes that there was. This created hundreds of thousands of refugees who came and migrated into Changsha. So Changsha suddenly found itself swollen with as many as 300,000 refugees, but the school stayed open. When Pettis greeted them at the dock when they arrived, they got with Mr. Pettis. He took them back to his family. They had a nice lunch around Maud Pettis's table, and they're all talking about their experiences and what to expect. Now, the men, after the brief stay in Changsha, the bachelors are going to go to Yunling because the school had been moved in 1938 to Yunling, an obscure town about 200 miles west of Changsha. And the reason it was moved, it was deemed to be relatively safe, and it was not a military target the way that Changsha was. This is where they're going to be teaching. So Art and Paul returned to the went out on a hike. They decided to hike all afternoon. They pointed out some temples and things they could sightsee on. When they came back late that afternoon, Jim Elliot was still in bed. He had not been feeling well. And then they found him shivering, sweating profusely. Somebody went next door to get a nurse. They got Pettis and one of the other doctors. He had a fever of 104. He was taken to the Tsinghua Hospital over here on the right, and he was stricken with malaria. This is a good picture of the Tsinghua Hospital. This is where Jim Elliot spent almost his entire 14 days there, because he got to Yunling about 10 days after the others. Here's a photo of him recovering in the hospital from malaria when he was stricken during that month. But Springer and Hopkins had to continue on. Robert Ashton Smith had to stay behind with Jim Elliot. So Brank Fulton, who was in Changsha, escorted them the rest of the way. So he had arranged a boat, and it was supposed to be a boat that left at 6 p.m., but either somebody got the AM and PM mixed up, or they was just 12 hours late. But they get to the boat. Paul was dismayed because he really had nice bed to sleep in. And he says, quote, he looks at this boat and he describes the accommodations. Quote, my first view of the boat was filled with dismay. It was covered with Chinese, like a piece of food left lying around is covered with ants. Most of them were asleep. We had to wedge our feet in between them to get our footing. I walked on dozens before we got to our quarters. The roof was covered. The floor was covered. The steps were covered. Even the walls were covered with sleeping or sleepy figures in various stages of dishevel. Our passageway was so packed with soldiers at all nights that it was well nigh impossible to get in and out of our cabin. So we were pretty well confined once we got out. We promptly tossed out our so-called mattresses, which had quite enough living creatures in them already. So we thought, why add one more? Okay. Now these guys, they take this boat, and you'll see right to the left of Changsha, you see a river in this lake. So they're going down this lake. They're going all the way here towards Yunling. And when they get there, they are met by a young man named Curtis. Curtis was an English-speaking student at the school who took them the rest of the way. He met them. They asked him, how long have you been waiting here? He said, about 4 days, because they really got thrown off with Jim Elliot being sick. So he takes them. They have a 4-mile hike to a bus station, and they're going to overnight in an inn before they take the final leg to Yunling aboard a bus. And I have a picture of the bus. It's built for passengers about this size. They're built for very small men or boys. The body of a bus that they rode in was a fairly new Chevrolet, but it was kind of, let's say it was of ancient vintage. It was run on rice wine, almost pure alcohol, and cheaper than gasoline. There were no aisles. All the available room was taken up by the seats. The seats were so close together that it became impossible for Paul and Art, who were both 6 feet, to get their knees in, and it was difficult to sit sideways because it was built for smaller passengers. But not all of the passengers were human. There was some livestock, mostly poultry, but they were not as objectionable as the constant spitters, all of which who seemed to occupy the center seats and insisted on spitting out the window, regardless of whoever was sitting in between them and the window rather than on the floor. They had complete disregard for another passenger. And he said the spitting was just constant, and it went on for 4 hours during that journey. There was also a nauseous soldier on the back row, way back here, who had his head sticking out of the window, making rather sickening noises. I don't know why that lasted for 70 years in my wife's grandmother's letterbox, but it did, and it was bad enough to write about. So upon arrival, Springer and Hopkins walked through Yunling for the first time. They were impressed by the electric lights all over the city, and the lights were brighter than any they had seen since Hong Kong. Now, I had this picture. This is after Jim Elliot arrived. This is Paul Springer at left. Don McCabe, another Yale-China teacher. This is who they're relieving. And Jim Elliot in a coolie straw hat in Yunling, 1941. It took Springer 2 months and 4 days to get from Camden, New Jersey to Yunling. That was a heck of a ride, but he said when they got here, it was all worth it because they were gleaming with these little Chinese boys saying, welcome, welcome, welcome. They were so excited because the new teachers are here. So that's why they came, to teach in wartime China. Here's the teachers. This is Paul Springer, Art Hopkins, Don McCabe, Bob Clark, and then Jim Elliot in the right on the back. These are the ones that did this entire venture to go out and see them and say here. So now they are the only American teachers in the whole school. The principal was Chinese. The dean was Chinese. Chemistry, math, physics, every other department was taught by Chinese except them. They were the ones that were there to teach English. Now, Paul described the teaching environment in the context of the Japanese threat to his mother. Quote, we're now in the midst of fall air raid season, and we have alarms daily. The alarms mean simply that there are enemy planes in the Providence. We have no bombs dropped since I've been here, only an occasional scouting plane visible. 2 days ago, there was an alarm, and shortly after, 15 planes flew over, throwing the town into a panic. And he later learned that they were Chinese military planes. Now, some of these times they taught their classes in front of dugouts. And this photo, you can see up close, you can see down below, you can see 1, 2, 3 blackboards here. And this is the senior school. You can tell by the size of the pupils. And they are reciting on the blackboard, and they're teaching the students. And sometimes they're sitting on benches or logs or rocks. Now, when an air raid siren went off, when a Chenpao went off, they knew that the planes were on the way. They knew that the Japanese planes were in the area. And so when they could actually hear the planes, they would all scamper inside of the bomb shelters, inside the dugouts. And they were carved out of solid rock. Jim Elliott described that, quote, Yali has its own dugouts, and very good ones too. They're hewn out of solid rock, far below the surface of the hill. This would certainly stand anything, even a direct hit that the Japanese have been using in the way of bombs. He had no qualms about the safety. He said, don't stand near the entrance. You could have a problem. Now, being an English major at Yale, Springer endeavored to teach his young students the importance of composition. Less than a month in his tenure, he asked the boys to write about the recent experiences. Most of you have had something like that. Oh, tell me about your summer. Tell me about your experience before we got here. The teacher wants to know something about you. So they started teaching, I think, September 23rd, 6th of October, 1941, My Boyhood's Friend by Bruno Huang Sing Fang. This is one of the original pieces of primary source info. It sat in my wife's grandmother's house for about 70 years until it was transferred to Houston, and we went through it. And here's this boy's story. 5 years ago, I was studying in primary school. I had a good friend who sat beside me, had the same lesson as I. He was a wise and saucy boy, always tricked other boys, but his lesson was very good. He often get high marks. So his classmates call him the litter monkey. Since the war began, I have come Hunan and we separated. Never knew where he was. Last winter, I was walking on the street. Suddenly, a stranger cried out my name. His body was tall and strong and dressed in military clothes. I was perplexed for a moment. At last, I remembered that he was my old friend, Litter Monkey. I hold his hand, cry with joy, and asked, how do you come here? He answered calmly and sadly that his home had been burned by Japanese soldiers. Father and mother had both been killed, and he had been captured like an animal. One night, he struggled away from the Thai and fled in Chinese fortifications. No longer, he had joined in the army and he had transposed here with the army. When he finished his talk, he wept out. I comforted him. At last, he said, tomorrow I will leave here and resist Japanese. I will help you. I'll see you again. Goodbye. This summer, I received a letter from one of his company. It said that he had been captured by Japanese. For his disobey, he had been killed cruelly. My heart almost broke when I got this bad message. I railed Japan. I respected his loyalty. Now I hope the God will bless him in heaven. It's you just don't know the experiences that some people went through during that war. And this brings it really home is what happened. Something else that brought home. Lieutenant General Shiro Issei. There was a crude form of biological warfare that was being developed by the Japanese under this general. One of his units focused its attention on the bubonic plague. The plan involved spreading the plague throughout China using infected rats. He led this, and what they did was they dropped infected rice bombs and wheat bombs on the Chinese cities of Changta and Ningbo. Now, Changta was on the way to Yunlin, so it wasn't that far. The plague erupted days later among the people. Chinese people tried to combat the plague. They isolated it. They quarantined. They burned the most infected parts of the city. Still, 500 people died in that town from the bubonic plague spread by Issei's forces. The Red Cross examined the wheat and the rice grains and the paper and the wadding which had been dropped on those funny Japanese bombs, and they found them impregnated with the bacilli of the bubonic plague. This came really close to Yunlin. Art Hopkins reported this. He said, the Japs have been dropping rat food from airplanes, and the food causes the fleas on the rats to transmit bubonic plague to anybody so unfortunate as to be bitten. So something as simple as a bite from a flea could have devastating consequences for the recipient. So what they decided to do, they're going to kill all the rats. You see the symbolic Japanese flag on that rat, like that's a Japanese flag rat because they've infected it. And here you can barely see, but under the Chinese characters, right to left, kill rats as you kill the enemy. That's what it reads. And at the lower left, you can see the Chinese characters Ya-Li Middle School drawn by Ya-Li Middle School. But this is Art Hopkins doing. Here's a picture of him on the cot. He recruited the students to do these. They put these posters up. They had to have rewards for people for killing rats and turning them in, and they burned them. And it was really a mess. You know, the poison gas attack, they used that in other parts of China. Springer wasn't really worried about Youngling because their quarters were way up high and there was a valley down below. He thought it would just settle in the valley down below. Springer offered this observation in a letter to his mother on December the 2nd, 1941, quote, "The Japs can't afford it at this stage of the game unless they intend to do great damage. I don't think Youngling has anything to fear from the Japs, as whatever they do now must be desperate and directed at a big objective." Well, that objective was achieved 5 days later when the U.S. entered the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. This completely changed their neutrality in the war. The Chinese students were thrilled that China now has a powerful ally. They attacked the United States, and now the United States is going to be their ally. And the bachelors, they didn't know what to do. They just they heard about it on the radio like everybody else, but all of a sudden they got looked at in a different light. One of the things that was immediate casualty, they couldn't get mail home. They couldn't send mail across the Pacific. I remember we had a speaker about 2 months ago on one of the afternoon programs. I think it was Charles Epting was his name, about the World War II stamps. This is a World War II stamp with Sun Yat-sen. How did they get letter? You know, there was no mailbox to drop it in. So he literally would type out, take this via CNAC to Calcutta, Chinese National Air Corps, via British Airways overseas to Lagos, Nigeria, then from Lagos, Nigeria to destination by Pan American Airways. So anything they could do to get the letters home. This one made it home. Needless to say, the U.S. entry into the war turned the Yale medical and educational mission upside down. Dr. Win Pettis and his medical staff were forced to abandon Changsha in January 1942 when the Japanese made another attempt to recapture the city. Although they were driven out by Chinese forces, these are Chinese forces at the bottom. When he returned, Pettis could barely recognize the Xingya Hospital because its roof was blown off. It had been gutted by fire, and yet he had it operating within a month. Paul Springer was recruited by the American Embassy in Chungking for a job driving a friend ambulance unit on the Burma Road, hence his Chinese driver's license. At first, this involved delivering medical supplies to field hospital. Later, he would remove the wounded off the battlefields and transport them to field hospitals. So he got pretty close to the action. When the Japanese cut the Burma Road in the spring of 1942, he received another job offer for the embassy, first as a top secret code clerk, then later as a vice consul, a junior diplomat. Jim Elliott, here on the left, was a conscientious objector. He got an additional year of draft determinant and remained at the school in Youngling to teach. I love this picture of him and Hopkins at the right with 7 of the students of the middle school. This was taken on Christmas Day of 1942. Speaking of Hopkins, he served as a summer internship with Flying Tigers Commander General Claire Lee Chenault in 1942. The air war and his participation in it runs all through the second half of the book. So when his two-year teaching commitment was finished in July of 43, Hopkins joined the 14th Air Force as a lieutenant. He served as a combat grand liaison because he spoke Chinese at this point, and he coordinated American air support with the Chinese ground forces to accurately target the military objectives, which is disrupting and destroying the Japanese supply lines. So this book is an engaging story about Americans in China, educating civilians, healing the wounded, and supporting the Chinese military resistance against Japanese imperialism. And it is the untold story of life on the ground in free China during the Japanese occupation. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Lauren.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation. I know that's a part of history that I am not very familiar with, so I really appreciate you sharing it with us. And we discussed this yesterday in our rehearsal, but I was hoping you might be able to speak a little bit towards the personal connection you have with this story.
It's pretty personal. I married Springer's prettiest daughter. That's pretty personal. We got to be friends. He rarely talked about Yale-in-China. He talked about, yeah, I used to teach at Yale-in-China during the war, and then I drove a truck on the Burma Road, and we knew he got a job at the State Department, and he had a 20-year career in the CIA afterwards, which is another story, which will follow. But he's one of those guys one of those old World War II guys, that toughest generation. They really didn't talk about this stuff, but it was when we discovered the letters. And my wife's grandmother apparently saved everything. Every letter was opened on the edge. It was opened with a knife. It was never torn. They were perfectly preserved. And it was only when I went through it that I kept seeing a letter from Art, a letter from Paul. They kept writing about the surgeon. And it was when I ordered all of their correspondence from the Yale University Library, who were very, very helpful, by the way, that I began to see the bigger picture. And I realized it just wasn't about Springer, although he is no doubt one of the central characters.
I have a question. I'm just kind of curious, from your perspective, what was the most surprising aspect of this story?
There were two things. The most surprising aspect was just how difficult it was to get to China in those days. It took Paul 2 months and 4 days to get from from New Jersey to Yunling. It took Jim Elliott right at 2.5 months to get from, Green, New York, all the way to Yunling. There was just difficult travel going across the way. I talked to an elderly friend who's now gone. He was in his 90s. He was in high school at the time, and he read a copy of the manuscript. He said, yeah, it brought back memories. It was really, really tough to get across China during the war when it was occupied. That was one thing. The other one was, and this is in the second half of the book, I never understood the extent of the American involvement in China during World War II, not just the military involvement, but the diplomatic involvement, and just how heavily the Chinese communists in Yunnan were courting the American military and the American diplomats for financial and military aid, so that they could enlist their help in fighting the Japanese. That's a long and complicated story, but it was one that I had no idea was going to come. But as you're researching this, you're learning it as you're writing, and those I think were the two biggest surprises to me.
All right, we have a question from the audience. What happened to Yale-in-China after the war?
Yale-in-China after the war continued in its shape after up till about 1949, and it continued. They had a lot of rebuilding. They wanted to move the school back. They eventually moved the school back to Changsha. They continued to teach, and then when the communists took over after the People's Revolution in 1949, they made it. They called it, I think, the People's Liberation School. The staff was persecuted. They were publicly persecuted. Dwight Rue, who was my father-in-law's boss and the director of Yale-China at that point in time, he was held in, just call him in detention, and he finally got away in 1950. The story of how he got out is also in the epilogue, in the final chapters after that. But Yale-China has continued, and it's continued in Hong Kong to this present day. At present time, that it's now called the Yale-China Association. They have a wonderful educational mission, and it still continues in Hong Kong to this day.
All right, we have another question, and then we're probably going to wrap up quickly. When and how did he leave China?
When and how did I view China?
Yes, when and how did he leave China? I think your father-in-law.
When and how did he leave China? Oh, that's interesting. This is also in the book too, because when the Japanese cut the Burma Road, he lost the job at the Friends Ambulance Unit. He had a friend named George who he met on the ship traveling over, George worked in Chungking. He had interviewed in Chungking with John Carter Vincent because he thought he was going to get, school might be shut down. So he had a job for 2 more years as a top secret code clerk with the top security clearance. And after 3 years in China, he requested to be sent to a warmer climate because it was a really hardship post. And so Paul Springer got transferred to Cairo, Egypt in 1944. And then his story continues in Egypt when he's working at the U.S. legation in Cairo, while you see what happens to Pettis and Hopkins and Elliot back in China. So the story takes a big, broader push at that point.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you again, James, for your insightful presentation. This was a period of history I was not aware of, and it looks like some of our audience members were not very aware of it either. So thank you for sharing your fascinating story with us. Real quick, I want to remind everybody that we have a webinar coming up next month entitled Battle of Midway, Code Breaking. Again, I want to say thank you to everybody for logging in for our presentation today, and I hope to see you next time.
Very good. Very good. Thank you so much.